Majority Whip.
Mr. President, when the pandemic began last year, Americans across the country were faced with more than one public health crisis. While we all feared contracting COVID-19 outside of our homes, the most vulnerable members of our communities feared a danger lurking within the home, or certainly in the neighborhood: violent crime. During the first several weeks of the pandemic, police departments across America reported a significant increase in arrests or calls related to domestic violence. And reports of hate incidents and crimes increased as well, particularly those targeting Asian American, Pacific Islander, or what is known as the AAPI community. Nearly 4,000 of these hate incidents were reported during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and AAPI women comprised a majority of the victims. In my home state of Illinois, some of these victims of violent crime have an indispensable resource they can turn to. It's known as CanWin, a nonprofit that supports survivors of violence, particularly women and members of the immigrant community. CanWin offers a 24-hour hotline, legal advocacy, transitional housing, sexual assault services, and many more resources to survivors of violent crime. They also offer programming to support children who've grown up in a traumatic environment. During the pandemic, organizations like CanWin have been a beacon of hope for some of the most vulnerable members of our community. But these beacons of hope are at the risk of going dark unless we, in this Senate, today, take immediate action by passing the Voca fix to sustain the Crime Victims Fund Act. This legislation, which I'm proud to introduce with Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, will replenish the Crime Victims Fund, which Congress established in 1984 with the passage of the Victims of Crime Act, known as Voca. The Crime Victims Fund helps abused children, survivors of domestic violence, and other victims of violent crime access the professional services they desperately need. It also assists victims with expenses like medical bills, counseling, funeral costs, loss of wages. And importantly, the Crime Victims Fund supplies grants to thousands, literally thousands of victim service providers across the nation, like CanWin. In CanWin's case, the Crime Victims Fund pays for the salary of their children's advocate. That advocate reached out to my office and wrote the following: "The entire children's program at CanWin faces elimination," unquote, if the Voca fix to sustain the Crime Victims Fund does not pass the Senate. Without this legislation, quote, linguistically and culturally sensitive services and counseling, education assistance, economic assistance, medical assistance, art activities that help regulate children's emotion, parent-child relationship assistance, and other case management services will be cut. And the kids who receive help from CanWin are far from the only people who would be hurt if the Crime Victims Fund runs dry. Children's advocacy centers in Illinois report that a significant cut in Voca funding would result in more than 1,500 children being deprived of services they need to overcome trauma. The Chicago Children's Advocacy Center writes, and I quote, "One of the most important uses of Voca funds for mental health therapy for sexually abused children is at risk. And without that funding, they will have to, quote, cut the number of children we provide therapy to, and more children would go without life-changing treatment to heal from their abuse. Even a small cut in Voca would mean up to 100 children would go without healing services." Madam President, we have a serious problem across America, and I've seen it in Illinois, particularly in the city of Chicago, of gun violence. There's so many guns. The city is awash in guns. Too many young people get their hands on them every day. On the 4th of July weekend, 104 people were shot in the city of Chicago. 104. 19 died. Last weekend, 50. The numbers are staggering. We have a mass shooting in the city of Chicago every weekend. It has become, sadly, expected breaks your heart. I went to the juvenile facility of Cook County several years ago and talked to the counselors who were meeting with the adolescents who've been charged in these gun crimes. Some of these adolescents spend a year or two in that facility waiting for trial. And I asked these counselors, who are these kids? What has happened to them to the point where they can take a gun and just shoot wantonly into a crowd, killing infants and children and grandmothers and innocent people? And the counselor said to me, there are many things. There are hardly any serious mental illnesses that you can think of that we don't find in these kids. But the one thing we find, Senator, consistently is they are the victims of trauma. Now, by classic definition, trauma is some physical injury, but trauma today is viewed in a much larger context. It goes back to a template that was established by the Humana Corporation called Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs for short. Most psychologists and child counselors know exactly what I'm talking about. ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, can be as simple as witnessing a violent crime or returning to a home where the parent is not a positive force. Perhaps the only parent is drug addicted or alcoholic or not home at all. Having a situation where you're never sure where home is. So many kids in school talk about moving back and forth from one relative to another. All of these things take their toll on little kids. It's part of the traumatic experience. And these counselors of these gun-toting adolescents say that over 90% of them are victims of trauma. You stop and think, is that possible? That simple thing that happened in a child's life could have that kind of impact? Well, I'm afraid it is. And for many of us, just to think back on your childhood, of the most memorable moment in your childhood, I hope it's a good memory, one that you smile with. But it could be a terrible memory too, the loss of someone you love or some other tragic event. Well, that's what's happened to these kids. This trauma in their lives runs the risk of changing them and making them dangerous to innocent people that they live around. And that's why when we talk about Victims of Crime Act and giving these kids counseling, a child who witnesses a domestic violence incident in their home where their mother is being beaten or worse, how in the world do you erase that from your memory? You only hope that you can find someone, some mentor, some counselor who can talk you through it. That's what Voca does. The victims of crime have an opportunity to access those professional services before they do the damage that they do. So how did we get to this point where we're even debating whether to fund this? Why is the Crime Victims Fund so dangerously close to running out of money when we know we need it so much? Well, it comes down to how the fund is funded. See, the money for victims of crime doesn't come from taxpayer dollars. Traditionally, it comes from criminal fines, penalties, forfeited bail bonds, and special assessments collected by the federal government. Historically, these criminal fines have accounted for the largest portion of the funding. But in recent years, deposits in the Crime Victims Fund have dropped significantly, as the Justice Department has increasingly used deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements. Monetary penalties from these deferred prosecutions and non-prosecution agreements are currently deposited into the General Treasury, not into the Crime Victims Fund. As a result, this shift in sentencing has resulted in a devastating impact on the fund. That's why a bipartisan, bicameral coalition of lawmakers have worked with advocacy organizations to write a fix to the Voca law to sustain the Crime Victims Fund Act. Our bill would stabilize the Crime Victims Fund by redirecting monetary penalties from deferred prosecutions and non-prosecution agreements to the victims and service providers that desperately need the financial support. If you think that is an easy and obvious fix, you don't understand Congress. To have all the different committees of jurisdiction take a look at it, and all the members take a look at it, and to come up with a solution doesn't happen every day. And one of the reasons it happened here in the Senate is because of one of my colleagues, who I want to put in the record as a major positive force. Senator Tammy Baldwin, of the state of Wisconsin, took a real personal interest in this, and I thank her for it. She brought us together and came up with a solution and worked out the details, and there were many, until we could all agree. And I thank her personally and specifically in the course of this opening remark. The reduced deposits into the fund have had a devastating impact. She knew it, I do, and everyone does. As of this year, victim assistance grants have been reduced by more than $600 million nationwide, and even more catastrophic cuts were looming if we don't fix it today. So far, in 2021, this Crime Victims Fund has already missed out on nearly $550 million in deposits, which they would see coming their way if our fix is in place. We're not even halfway through the year. Imagine how much more money this fund is going to lose if we don't pass this bill. So there's no time to waste. Every day that goes by, we miss an opportunity to help replenish this fund. More importantly, we miss an opportunity to help a crime victim. It may be a medical bill. It could be a funeral cost. It could be counseling for that child that I described earlier. Missing that opportunity may mean that the life of that child will never quite be the same. The Senate must immediately pass this bill. The House already did it in March. It's time for us to get around to it. So with broad bipartisan support in the House, we should be inspired in the Senate by our bipartisan coalition backing the bill. 63 senators, 42 Dems, 21 Republicans. Not bad. We've all come together for the Voca fix. Over the past few months, an objection has prevented us from moving forward on this legislation. We've been literally waiting for weeks to pass this bill. Today, we have a chance to do it and to send it to the president's desk. That's why this afternoon we're going to take two votes. The first is on an amendment from Senator Toomey. It doesn't address the substance of the programs that I mentioned. It addresses the budget process. There is mention, of course, of this bill, but his change would reach far beyond any single piece of legislation. We'll consider it. I'll be opposing it. Others will get their chance to vote, and then we face final passage on the House-passed bill. A broad coalition of victims' rights advocates, service providers, and law enforcement organizations are urging the vote I just described against the Toomey Amendment and for the final bill. They recently wrote to us, the Voca Fix Act is a narrowly tailored, carefully negotiated technical fix bill to address the immediate needs of survivors. And the Senate must act now to pass this critical legislation without amendment. Every day of delay allows potential funds that should be deposited in the Crime Victims Fund to serve victims instead of the general treasury. The House passed Voca Fix Act more than 4 months ago with overwhelming bipartisan support. We urge the Senate to similarly pass the House-passed Voca Fix Act immediately. More than 1,700 national, regional, state, tribal, and local organizations are begging us to do this and do it today so we can send it to the president and ensure that the victims are able to maintain access to services they desperately need. We owe it to the victims to get this done. I see my colleague on the floor who co-sponsored this bill with me. He was the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman in the previous Congress, and I have that honor in this Congress. And I'm glad that we could get together, a Democrat and a Republican. Again, we've co-sponsored things before and will continue to. I want to thank Senator Graham for his leadership and joining on this effort. I think it's a good one, and we need more of them. I yield the floor.